when you look at the last meeting of Zelensky with Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell, in which Mitch McConnell says that we are going to send a message through this war in Ukraine. If they were that concerned about China and its role, why they started this war, this conflict in Ukraine in the first place? Because it seems to me that this war is not going the way they want it to be. The Russian economy is doing great right now, as Bloomberg reported just recently, and Germany's economy is shrinking. If that was in their mind, why we cannot have Russia in the middle to have some sort of balance between East and West?
Well, you raised an excellent point, and that's something I've been advocating for many years now. Actually, 2 decades. I've been calling for a kind of a rapprochement with Moscow, that where the U.S. and Russia would have some kind of comprehensive grand peace agreement where we work out all of our major differences, and in all areas of their key interests, we would recognize those, and they would recognize ours. So all of our vital interests would be protected. But unfortunately, as you alluded to, President Biden opted to choose this war. That's why I call it Biden's war in Ukraine rather than Putin's war in Ukraine, because Putin actually spent 15 years trying to resolve the Ukraine and NATO issue diplomatically. A lot of obviously there's no neoconservative Republican or liberal internationalists, very few liberal internationalists that would admit the fact that that Russia did try to avoid war, went to great lengths, in fact, to avoid war, even presenting a mutual security agreement designed to permanently end the conflict, the Cold War between the U.S. and NATO on one hand, and the Russian Federation on the other. Whereas, we've basically been involved in this new Cold War ever since 2008, essentially, when they had the Bucharest Declaration, which said that NATO would be expanded to include Georgia and Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, being Russia's number one vital interest on their side. So much as Taiwan is for China. So as far as this bill, this new Ukrainian aid bill, it's a vast amount of money. It's 61 plus $billion. We've already sent Ukraine upwards of $115 billion at least. Much of which, of course, is or a great percentage of which has been sold off in terms of U.S. arms to on the Ukrainian black market to enrich Ukraine's de facto dictator, Volodymyr Zelensky, and other regime officials. And this war I can't underscore the fact how very counterproductive it is to U.S. national security interests. I'm a great patriot here in the U.S., much as I'm sure you are as well. And it's important to recognize other countries' legitimate security interests. If the Russia and China were to establish a client state or an allied state in Mexico, Canada, perhaps even a secessionist Republic of Texas, particular, we would we would invade, bomb, and annex all of Texas and call it a defensive war. I'm not justifying Putin by any means, but I think it's important to think through Russian eyes in terms of how we would feel under the same circumstances. And as Dr. John Mearsheimer has stated, the U.S. would act very similarly, if not, I would argue, even more brutally under the same circumstances, because it was in our national security interests to kind of roll back this enemy alliance that NATO poses to Russia in Ukraine.
When you look at the Biden administration's strategy right now in Ukraine, do they have any clear plan in Ukraine? What they're doing? What's the end game for them right now?
The only end game that I've been able to discern they have is to weaken Russia. They view Russia as some kind of Cold War relic, geopolitical foe. And granted, Russia is an enemy, but it's only an enemy because the U.S.'s policies have made it an enemy. Putin, of course, came to power as a pro-Western leader, certainly more of a hardliner and more, smarter and more nationalistic than his predecessor, Boris Yeltsin. But nevertheless, a Russian leader who was very committed to integrating with the EU economically and with the Western alliance, if not NATO itself, which he actually expressed interest in having Russia join NATO in 2002, then some kind of common house, collective security agreement, likely based on the OSCE, which includes all former Soviet republics as well as EU states and other neutral powers in Europe. So that is, there's been several great books published recently. One recent one is called "The Lost Peace," kind of how the U.S. Essentially lost the Cold War peace and stumbled into this new Cold War with Russia that's completely unnecessary. And the sad part is that the Biden administration really doesn't care at all about the lives of Ukrainians. It's all a farce. They don't care that Ukraine has lost at least 250,000 dead, mostly military, about 90%, if not more, military. 200,000 plus troops, probably at least 10,000 civilians that we know of, according to the UN Human Rights Commission. And I mean, the most humanitarian, the most pro-Ukraine policy we could have imagined would have been to avert the war in the first place by merely guaranteeing that Ukraine would never be allowed to join NATO, which that was Putin's minimum demand. And that was a guarantee we could have given at no cost to the U.S. in terms of our national security. It wouldn't have affected us in the least. NATO would not have been any weaker. Wouldn't have called for the rollback. Even Russia. Russia presented this wish list of maybe not demands, or somewhere between requests and demands. I mean, they were certainly forcefully asking for it, for these kind of their wish list. And on their wish list, there wasn't a demand for the rollback of NATO by even 1 square inch, merely the withdrawal of U.S. and Western NATO troops from Eastern Europe. So that was a really good compromise solution. It's one we could still do. I've been working for Vivek Ramaswamy, as I think we've discussed, as one of his defense and foreign policy advisors, and he essentially adopted my recommended plan to end the war in Ukraine, and that would include this withdrawal of U.S. troops from Eastern Europe as the means to establish a mutual security agreement with Russia, incorporating some, but not obviously, of course, not all of the elements of Russia's proposed draft treaty. But that's really what we need to get back to. And as you mentioned, um, you know, we're facing a Sino-Russian alliance. Russia and China, when there's two nuclear superpowers aligned against one, and they're allied with two other nuclear powers, North Korea and Iran, it should be obvious to everyone that the U.S. goal should be to break up the enemy alliance, lest we be overpowered, either militarily in a war or otherwise. So no one seems to be concerned at all about that. In fact, the war in Ukraine has pushed Russia closer into its military alliance with China. And China, of course, is the big winner of the war thus far.
You talk about this alliance. I think it's beyond alliance between Russia and China right now. And if something happens in Taiwan, what would be the reaction of Russia?
I mean, of course, there's Russian hardliners. I would not term Putin to be a hardliner. I think he's kind of in between the hardliners and the centrists. He's done a pretty good job holding the line as someone, as a leader who actually, contrary to all misconceptions, is actually very much committed to restraint when it comes to the military force. He very easily could have invaded all of Ukraine and annexed all of Ukraine in 2008 or 14, I guess 14, when the CIA-backed coup against President Yanukovych occurred. Yanukovych, of course, being a leader that was acceptable to Russia and pursued friendly relations with Russia, but did not want to join any kind of Russian alliance or anything like that, merely to have Ukraine remain a neutral buffer state, which is really what Putin has wanted all along. And this entire conflict, manufactured conflict that Biden really began in 2014 as vice president when he authorized the Maidan coup against Yanukovych, has really, that's really been, the reason that for the entire conflict. It's always been about NATO membership. Putin, of course, I mean, to the very last, I was monitoring Russian statements very closely all along. And in the run up to the war, it was 3 days before the war, he still stated that any peace with Ukraine, peaceful agreement, had to be based on the Minsk II agreement. Minsk II agreement, of course, would call for all of Donetsk being returned to Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, the entire Donbass region. So, if Putin was really hell bent on, annexing Ukraine or taking over Europe or invading NATO, one would think that he would have had much more expansionist aims, both with his draft peace agreement as well as his invasion of Ukraine, in which Russia gave up half of its occupied territory in a unilateral military withdrawal in April of 2002, in accordance with a interim peace agreement signed with Ukraine, since abandoned by Biden and Boris Johnson's behest.
In your opinion, why was the eagerness of Putin to have some sort of negotiating table on Ukraine was perceived by the US elites as his weakness? What are the roots of these kind of thinking?
So, as I mentioned, Putin has always wanted peace with the West, but his patience has grown very thin. And just realized I didn't fully answer your previous question, which is how would China react to how would Russia react to a Chinese invasion of
Go
Taiwan? And
on.
the answer I think is that they would ally with China against us and as an active participant in the war. I don't think they would necessarily attack the U.S. directly. I think they would let China try to destroy the U.S. with cyber and super EMP weapons, perhaps even a limited, a nuclear decapitation strike, counter space attacks. They might join in counter space attacks, but primarily just as an ally with China, perhaps I would say likely occupying and annexing Alaska, perhaps joining an invasion of Hawaii and perhaps even northern Japan. So, that's really, the U.S. would struggle badly to fight and let alone win a war against China over Taiwan. But if Russia were to join the war as an active belligerent on China's side, along with North Korea, of course, and probably Iran as well, it would really be an unwinnable war. And so that's why it's so imperative, as you've argued as well, I think, to end this war, for the not only to the restoration of international peace and stability, but also for America's own national security interests and Ukraine's as well. So, I mean, there's a lot of misperceptions that permeate the U.S. Foreign policy elites. We're led by neoconservative Republicans and liberal internationalists, Atlanticists who believe, like President Biden, that NATO is the be-all and end-all of U.S. national security, the very cornerstone of national security, not the U.S. nuclear arsenal, or the U.S. military itself, but rather our alliances with powers as weak as Montenegro and South Macedonia, countries which clearly weigh the U.S. down, and the Baltic states being the perfect example. Whereas if Russia were to stage a partial invasion of Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania, then according to prevalent theory, we'd be forced to risk nuclear annihilation in a war against Russia to defend, hundreds of square miles of sparsely inhabited territory in the Baltic region. So I think it's kind of a zero sum mentality. I would argue that zero sum mentality, the Cold War mentality, just simply doesn't apply to Russia because the Putin government or the Putin regime, however you choose to term it, is not inimical, naturally inimical to U.S. national security interests. They're not communist led. They don't have expansionist aims. Their aims are primarily defensive. They would not have annexed any territory had Bush not, forced the Bucharest Declaration that Ukraine and Georgia would join NATO. They have annexed, of course, a territory the size of North Korea, but that was not Putin's primary aim. And in fact, he tried many times to return Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast to Ukraine as part of his peace offers from February of 2022 to August 2000 or September of 2022. But the U.S., they perceived Russia's military withdrawal from northern Ukraine, from three of the 8 Russian-occupied oblasts, as a sign of weakness, and they instantly transformed from being okay with Zelensky negotiating a peace deal ending the war in Ukraine to wanting to, essentially march. I don't want to say march on Moscow, but the idiotic ideas that I heard coming from liberal internationalists and neocon Republicans have been so absurd. That Russia would collapse. Biden could make Russia collapse economically. Putin could be overthrown and hauled, for in front of a war crimes tribunal at The Hague. And just a lot of self-delusion and hubris. When the U.S. Has sent a very minimal number of troops, some of whom have died in combat in Ukraine, and somehow we think we can defeat Russia when Russia, it's 35 times larger than Ukraine. They have, 5 to 10 times as many artillery pieces, tanks, combat aircraft, 5.3 times more people. It's 11 times larger economically. There's never been any chance at all that Ukraine could win the war, and therefore the only humane foreign policy for the U.S. has always been to secure a peace with Russia on the best terms possible for Ukraine.
But the Biden administration is trying so hard to force Congress to pass some funds for Ukraine. Do you think at the end of the day, would Biden be successful in its attempts to do that?
I've heard mixed reports. The Republicans, as of now, even the neoconservative Republicans, are holding strong, using the question of border security or the issue of border security to oppose as kind of a pretense to oppose further aid to Ukraine, and I've been impressed that they've stood so strong and unified thus far. But of course, we know the neocon Republicans are always going to ally with Biden in the end. Mitch McConnell, of course, being the prime example, he's been pushing Ukraine aid all along, even though he's been paid $50 million by communist China. He's trying to continue to foment open war with the Russian Federation, and it's produced a complete disaster for Ukraine, and it threatens to spill over into a Sino-American war, a second Sino-American war. Of course, the first being fought over Korea, in which China successfully killed about 35,000 U.S. troops. But this is a disaster. It's an avoidable disaster. These are avoidable wars. World War III is imminent, but it's easily avoidable by U.S. politicians and other Western leaders that are have the courage to choose peace over war. And of course, with Biden, he's been the exact opposite. He's consistently chosen war over peace. The Democrats, when I grew up in the 80s, were a peace party. They were an anti-war party, and now that is flipped with the majority of Republicans being the anti-war party and the pro-peace party. So that's why it's so imperative that we elect a president like Vivek Ramaswamy, Governor DeSantis, or even President Trump to replace Biden, because those are the 3 leaders that will pursue. They're on record saying they would end the war in Ukraine and make peace with Russia, and one or more of them, I think, would have a better chance of making peace with China over Taiwan as well.
In Europe, we are facing huge changes in terms of their leaders. Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz are not that good in their position right now. It seems that they're going to be removed from the power. And we had in Slovakia, we had in Netherlands, leaders from the far right, far left, all of them, what's make them so united? It's this policy against the war in Ukraine. They are all against the war in Ukraine. Do you think at the end of the day, would they have some sort of leverage on the Biden administration, or whoever gonna be the next president of the US to bring this war, this conflict, this disaster that nobody's benefiting from that to some sort of sanity?
You know, I've described Europe as kind of a dominion of the U.S. The U.S. has what I describe as a liberal empire that it's tried to push all the way into Ukraine, to Russia's full borderline. Obviously, it succeeded in doing so in Finland, the Baltics, Poland, of course, also bordering on Kaliningrad. Um, so I think, for better or worse, and I would say a lot worse, Europe really finds itself hard to cut itself off or take a different, a wiser course or a different foreign policy path from that of U.S. leaders. So I think they look to the U.S. to call the shots in terms of defense and foreign policy, because they still view Russia as a threat. They don't think if the U.S. were to leave NATO, I think they'd be really alarmed and they would pursue peace with Russia out of necessity. I think that's a great idea. It's one I've championed since 2019 when I described NATO as a millstone around America's neck that could drag us down to an unnecessary nuclear war with the Russian Federation over the Baltic states, for example. I think we really, it's so important that we change course before it's too late, and save the not only the U.S. and our allies, but also potentially other countries bordering on our borders and in Europe as well.
When you look at the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, US stayed there for so long that there was nothing to be there, then they left. Do you think that the same case gonna happen to Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean it's inevitable, and a lot of the realist, foreign policy thinkers, myself included, have repeatedly stated, that we can't sustain Ukraine. We couldn't sustain Ukraine. We were given in their war effort, without U.S. aid, Ukraine would have long ago collapsed or been forced to make peace with Russia on the terms they proposed. We haven't really provided. There's been no military assistance authorized since December of 2022. So we've gone over a year, and the Biden administration, rammed a $47 billion aid package through Congress in December 2022, knowing that the Republicans would take the House the next year. Then it'd be much harder to pass it through a Republican-led House, but it's not feasible. I mean, all the reports I've seen say that Biden, behind the scenes, he has told Zelensky that he wants Zelensky to open negotiations with Russia and negotiate a peace in which they would essentially give up all the not formally cede but recognize Russian de facto control over the annexed regions of Ukraine, the five oblasts, in exchange for perhaps Ukrainian NATO membership. Now that's again the very reason that Putin invaded was NATO membership. So we hear all these people, including ones that thought that Biden is responsible for the war. They're now saying, well, yeah, let's do this grand agreement with Russia where they get to keep 18% of internationally recognized Ukrainian territory, and then the rest of Ukraine gets to be a NATO member. Maybe not right away, maybe in 5 to 10 years. But it's just absurd. I mean, that's the one issue that's non-negotiable with Russia. I mean, they'd rather give back a little bit of territory than and get firm commitment that Ukraine is, have Ukraine change its constitution to permanent neutrality, whereas now the constitution of Ukraine says they have to pursue NATO membership until they get it. So that's we need to be smart and wise in our foreign policy decisions, return to a policy of restraint. And this policy has been most disastrous for Ukraine. Ukraine has lost 30% of their GDP. They've lost 30% of their population, both to refugees and annexations. And they've lost, over 50% of their critical infrastructure has been destroyed. All these lives, they've lost 250,000 lives, probably a lot more, but probably minimally 250,000 lives. the longer this goes on, the more devastating it will be for Ukraine. And Ukraine is already substantially destroyed with reconstruction costs up to $1 trillion. So Putin has been he's never, he's had reasonable peace terms on the table since early March. The U.S. has ignored that. The Biden administration reportedly supported peace with Russia right up through mid-March, and then they, gradually came to this open-ended war. Where there's no end game. The only end game is to weaken Russia. It's not to protect or defend Ukraine. It's to use them as cannon fodder. Use the Ukrainians as cannon fodder. Kill off Ukrainians to produce what they believe is an end that supports U.S. national security by weakening the Russian Federation. But as you stated, Russia, we should not view Russia as the enemy when communist China is the real enemy. And we, of course, have to peacefully coexist with China. I'm not advocating war with China. I'm trying to avoid that as well with my compromise peace agreement over Taiwan with China. But Russia is very key right now because if we could flip Russia from a Chinese military ally to a military neutral, a neutral power, where they'd still be politically allied with China, but they wouldn't join any war against the U.S. That might make China think twice about risking all-out nuclear war with the United States.
Are we going to have some sort of problem in Ukraine considering these neo-Nazis?
Well, I mean, that's the one area I would differ from the way Russia's characterized Ukraine. I don't believe neo-Nazis control the Ukrainian government. Of course, we know that the Azov regiment is 100% neo-Nazi. Certainly, there are other factions in and out of the Ukrainian government that are neo-Nazi or extremists. But I don't view that as a big problem. So, one thing I will bring up to your viewers is that Zelensky was elected as a president who was totally committed to peace with Russia and implementing the Minsk II agreement, and he attempted to do so very sincerely. And as he was withdrawing Ukrainian troops from the Donbass region, as part of that agreement, he tried to get the Ukrainian militia groups to the far right neo-Nazi groups to withdraw their militia forces as well. And in response, they put his wife's name on the Ukrainian kill list. So they threatened his wife with assassination. So that was kind of the turning point for him, in which he decided to pursue a more militarist and you know anti-Russian policy that led to this unfortunate war. But at this point, he's in a much more precarious position where it's unclear whether he could survive politically if he were to do an about face. I mean, I think that he'd have a reasonable chance of um, retaining power temporarily. I don't think he would be assassinated if he were to do an armistice agreement with Russia along the lines I advocated in my September 2022 national interest piece. But he may have those fears because his family's been personally threatened by the far right neo Nazis before. But no, I don't think that a serious obstacle to a post war scenario.
We have a lot of talks about how Biden could have reacted to this conflict in Gaza. Most people that I talk with, they're not satisfied with the Biden's policy in Gaza and Israel. In your opinion, what was the main problem of the Biden administration's policy in Gaza?
Well, I think that the Biden administration went too far to give Israel a blank check. We've seen what happens when countries give blank checks to other countries, like smaller countries, as Germany did to Austria-Hungary during World War I, and that in dealing with Serbia, and that dealt to the First World War that led to the First World War, which cost the lives of 40 million people, and then subsequently the Peace of Versailles, which uh, you know uh, the First World War birthed communism and Nazism, and then the Peace of Versailles did as well. So I don't think I don't think the chances of World War III are that great over the Gaza conflict, because I think all parties, I think there's cooler heads will prevail in Israel and Iran, Iran, I believe, is a nuclear power. I know that's not a widely accepted view, but based on my research, it's had nuclear missiles for some time now. Not a large arsenal by any means, but certainly long-range missiles that could hit Israel, NATO, and perhaps one or two that could range the U.S., the United States of America. And Israel, of course, being the fourth largest nuclear power in the world with 400 nuclear weapons. So Iran doesn't have any desire, I think, to attack Israel directly. They're very happy to do so through proxy attacks to attack both the U.S. and Israel with the Houthis in the Red Sea, of course, and then Iranian proxies in Israel and Syria, Iraq and Syria, where U.S. Troops are still deployed for no reason. You know, as you mentioned, there was no reason to invade Iraq, and I was vehemently against that, and actually lost my prized position on the U.S. Army headquarters staff as a civilian as a result of my, public opposition to Bush's war plans to invade Iraq. But I think the mistake has been they've given Israel just too much leeway. And I'm not necessarily saying that the U.S. should control Israel. What I'm saying is the U.S. should not be providing military, arms and military assistance to Israel unless it pursues a more reasonable policy in Gaza. And when I say reasonable, um, Israel has been engaged in a collective punishment campaign, which has led to the deaths of nearly 23,000 Gazans to date. Excuse me, of which they admit two-thirds are civilians, most of which are women and children. So we've seen the destruction of or damaging of 60% of Gaza home residences, 80%, fully 80%, nearly 2 million Gazans are now refugees. And Israel has been pursuing a blockade, air, land, and sea blockade, starving them of food, and humanitarian assistance. And, they have reopened some limited humanitarian assistance, international assistance recently. But no power, no internet, little to no food. They're all, 80% homeless, living in tents in best cases, or at homes, friends in South Gaza. And, the Israeli plan is, I'm actually, I tried to publish a piece on my Substack at dpyne.substack.com, the Real War newsletter, before this interview, but I wasn't able to get it done in time, but it should be published in the next day or two. But they are pursuing a plan that I kind of call a stealth annexation of Gaza, where they're trying to push out the Palestinians out of Gaza, and they're planning on an indefinite Israeli military occupation, kind of transforming Gaza into a protectorate, much like the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia during World War II that Germany established, in which there might be some kind of not even puppet leaders, really just nominal Palestinian leaders of some organizations that provide the credence for essentially Israeli, permanent Israeli control of the Gaza Strip. And of course, Israel did control Gaza from 1967 to 2005, occupying them militarily. But with these, with the disgusting and horrific Hamas terrorist attacks that killed 1,200 Jews on October 7th, Israel has really responded in very brutal ways, unfortunately. And they've killed, even by their own admission, they've killed Palestinian civilians at a rate 10 times higher than the Russians have killed Ukrainian civilians in Ukraine.
This attitude of the Netanyahu administration, how is it going to help Israel considering long-term strategy? What would be the consequences of these extreme measures that they're taking right now in Gaza?
Yeah, I mean they're trading tactical successes and immediate near-term security for long-term security, and all the decent relations they were rebuilding with Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, is now getting flushed down the toilet. I mean, even the president of Turkey, who's of course an admitted Islamist and not exactly a friend of the U.S., even though they're Turkey's a member of NATO. He's been trying to align with Russia and China of late. Has said that, I mean, made statements essentially that Netanyahu needs to be ousted. And the same, he talks about Netanyahu the same way Biden talks about Putin as a murderer, a war criminal, needs to be removed from power. With large regional powers like that in the Middle East region, that obviously Iran is a committed enemy. Syria is a committed enemy, although pretty neutered. Syria never shoots back against Israeli airstrikes. Israel bombs them all the time and has for decades, which is very, very tragic. I mean, no, I don't think any nation should be subject to that. But the U.S. has done, of course, invaded Syria unprovoked in Iraq during the last couple decades. But Israel does have legitimate national security interests, and I wasn't opposed to the Israeli invasion of Gaza, but I wanted it to be temporary. The last time that Israel invaded Gaza in let's see, it was 2014. 2014, they invaded for 18 days. So they went in, seriously degraded Hamas, killed a bunch of Hamas terrorists, and then pulled out. And they relied primarily on air power, special forces for that invasion. And that's kind of what I was hoping. I was wanting to see a repeat of that. But instead of a 2.5 week occupation of Gaza, and that was just a partial invasion of Gaza. This one is full-bore invasion and occupation of Gaza. That's there's no end date. I would love to see. I would like to see. I'm not adverse to the Israeli plan for the assimilation of Gaza, providing they give God-given rights to the Gaza civilians of the freedom of life, liberty, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, education, whatnot. If they could have all those rights, I would be okay with Gaza citizens not being able to vote. Necessarily choose their own leaders, as long as they have these basic human rights, and mainly the right to life, because they're being bombed and killed by Israel right now. So if we could have that transition, that would be a lot better than the situation we have now. But at this point, yeah, I'm worried. Even that plan is, to establish a protectorate over Gaza is just cover for permanent Israeli control and further degradation of the lives and liberties of Gaza civilians. But I don't want to minimize Israeli security concerns with the Hamas terrorist horrific attacks. I mean, I don't believe they butchered it. They didn't cut babies' heads off. I think that was a propaganda story that was proven false. But they did kill scores of Israeli children, and it's unacceptably wrong. It's just I from the beginning I've been worried that Israel would overreact and kill a bunch of civilians, and apparently that's their policy, unfortunately.
If the Netanyahu administration was looking for fighting Hamas, why they were bombing churches, hospitals?
Well, of course, we do know that Hamas does have tunnel networks, and they have established headquarters underneath a major hospital in Gaza. That's their main headquarters militarily, probably politically as well. And they have they do use human shields, unfortunately, to try to for multiple reasons. In many ways, to garner international opposition against Israel. Because when Israel attacks Hamas positions and tunnel networks, they kill more civilians as well. So we've seen Ukraine do the same thing again in their war against Russia. They fire from schools and hospitals, and then when Russia fires back, that Russia gets accused of killing a bunch of innocent civilians, which isn't their primary objective. Unfortunately, I think Israel is one of their primary objectives, is to not necessarily to kill as many civilians as possible, but what I see they're trying to do is to make living conditions in Gaza so difficult and unlivable and unbearable that all of the Gaza citizens will want to leave Gaza, and thus Gaza will essentially, in all but name, be ethnically cleansed of Palestinians, leaving Israeli settlers able to occupy their homes and lands, and perhaps even have formal annexation of Gaza. So I don't think Israel is 100% in the wrong, because I do think that Hamas does use human shields, but Israel, again, I think Israel has overreacted. They're bombing too many schools, too many um, hospitals. I mean, there's only 1/3 of hospitals in Gaza that are still in operation. Of course, with with no power, or just generators, it's almost impossible. Limited fuel supplies. It's been very difficult to treat all the the wounded. I think there's 58,000 wounded by last count, um, that have been wounded in the war on the Palestinian side. So that's a vast number of women and children, especially, that are need or desperately need of medical treatment.
You talk about these relations between Erdogan from Turkey and Netanyahu. We know that 40% of oil in Israel comes from Azerbaijan, goes through Turkey to be added in Israel. When it comes to these precautions between Netanyahu and Erdogan, they have tremendous problems if Turkey cuts this line of providing oil to Israel. But it seems to me that the Netanyahu administration doesn't consider any of this.
Well, I think it's because Biden has issued essentially a U.S. security blank check to Israel, essentially saying, they reportedly even stated, don't worry about Hezbollah on your northern borders. If they attack you massively, we'll strike back. We'll destroy them on your behalf. To kind of reduce the chances that Israel would try to stage a third or fourth invasion of Lebanon, of southern Lebanon, to try to preemptively strike against Hezbollah. So I think that with U.S. Military backing, Netanyahu feels that were he to lose this Azerbaijani oil shipments, that the U.S. would make up the difference, and I'm absolutely sure that Biden would do that. Unfortunately, I think 80 to 90% of U.S. politicians would do the same thing. Even if Trump were president, that he would do so as well. So again, Netanyahu is pursuing these limited aims. Much like Hitler. I mean, I don't want to. That's like, I know that's radioactive to compare Israel to Hitler. I think Israel is a great country. I worked with Israelis when I was in the U.S. Army headquarters staff. I had Israeli friends. I haven't kept in touch with them. But just from a non-biased perspective, Hitler wasn't trying to go to war with Britain, France, and the U.S., or even Poland for that matter. He had limited objectives. His main aim was to establish an Eastern alliance in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, to fight the Soviet Union, to fight this massive war, to get all this Lebensraum. Of course, he was a total racist and mass murderer, and ended up mass murdering the Jews for reasons we don't have time to explain, but which I do explain in my articles on the Real War newsletter. Netanyahu just he has these. He's just laser focused on Greater Israel. I call it. Dr. John Mearsheimer has also used the term Greater Israel, much like Hitler was pursuing Greater Germany. Now, Gaza is a very small piece of territory. It's the rest of Israel is 57 times larger, but it's strategically placed, on the coastline with Egypt. And Netanyahu actually discussed, I think, with the Egyptian president in 2007, that he asked Egypt if they would accept all the Gaza residents, the Palestinians in Gaza, to resettle in the Sinai Peninsula, so Israel could annex Gaza. So we're seeing his objectives of 2007 play out right now, and it is a pursuit of Greater Israel. And I'm not saying that I necessarily oppose Israeli annexation of Gaza, providing they provide these basic, fundamental, God-given rights to the Palestinian civilians. And I am very concerned that Israel has no plans or intention to grant those rights to Gaza residents.
What would be the solution, the practical solution to what's going on right now in Gaza between Israel and Palestinians?
The ideal solution, I think, would be for what I initially argued for would be a Fatah takeover of the Gaza Strip, where Gaza and the West Bank would have a unified government, maybe some kind of coalition government where, Fatah and the PLO, the Fatah part of the PLO would lead Gaza once more. Of course, that was the case until 2006 when Hamas won democratic elections and defeated Fatah, and then of course when Hamas established a military dictatorship in 2007 over Hamas. But that I think would be ideal because the problem is any elections held under Israeli control. I don't think Israel will ever allow democratic elections in Israeli occupied Gaza. But if they did, they might, even it would be viewed as a collaborationist government, whether those leaders are appointed or elected, especially if they're appointed by Israel, which I think they will be. It'll be like the equivalent of Vichy France. Vichy France was a legitimately elected, people forget, a legitimately elected government, where the leader of the president of France declared himself dictator. But it's just a really difficult, much more difficult than the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is very easy to solve. It has a very easy solution. It's an armistice along the current lines of control, no NATO membership. Uh, you know, Ukraine doesn't agree to cede any territory to Russia outside of Crimea, but they recognize Russian de facto control. And then, we have some kind of limited security guarantee for the rest of Ukraine. Um, Really just taking away any reason for Russia to reinvade. And I know I'm very, very confident that could be accomplished because Putin's demonstrated no desire to take any territory outside the Donbass region. But it's just so much more complicated with Gaza because Israel has legitimate security concerns, and they're not willing. I mean, they're the dominant power for better or for worse, and I think for better overall in Gaza, just like Russia's the dominant power in Eastern Europe and in Ukraine. So we have to have a peace that's acceptable to Israel. So the Biden administration should be an advocate for Gaza citizens and civilians. They should be hammering out some kind of peace proposal or, arrangement, and maybe that could be the demilitarization of, Gaza, where Gaza has no Palestinian security troops at all, where Israel will take over the security role in exchange for for self-rule, for autonomy, for some limited democratic elections, and then some kind of constitution for a Palestinian entity in Gaza where they're guaranteed basic rights, basic fundamental human rights. So um, that's obviously complicated even more by the fact that Israel has not been killing a lot of Hamas terrorists. They focus more on civilians, I think. And by their own accounts, they've killed no more than 7,000 out of 47 or 48,000 Hamas fighters that were the numbers before the war. Hamas may have recruited many more since then, because no country likes to be invaded and occupied by foreign troops, and there's a legitimate patriotic reason to rally to defense, even if you hate your government and have a terroristic government like Hamas. So it's really not as black and white. Here in the West, there's Fox News especially. It's very black and white. Israel good, can do no wrong. Uh, Hamas, Gaza, they're all the same. They're all evil. Just like the U.S. painted all Japanese and Germans as evil due to the evil deeds and actions, aggressive actions of their leaders. And it's just wrong. It's collective punishment is wrong, whether it's Hitler killing up, mass murdering, 5 to 6 million Jews, or it's some other country killing off other populations, or simply just viewing them as legitimate targets. They're civilians, like Gaza civilians, or Russian civilians for that matter, as legitimate military targets, because under the rules of war, those are war crimes. And those are prosecutable war crimes and should be prosecuted under uh, the Geneva and Hague Conventions.
David, what's going on right now in the Red Sea? When it all started, we thought that Saudi Arabia and UAE going to be part of this, but they didn't participate in this operation. And Europeans are not willing. France was not willing to do that as well. With all that said, how do you see the policy in the Red Sea? Are we going to have some sort of escalation in their operation, or the US, the Biden administration, gonna have some sort of negotiations with some Arab states to calm down everything in that region?
Well, I mean, Houthis are a really legitimate target for us because they've been firing a lot of advanced anti-ship missiles in the direction of U.S. warships and against merchant vessels of various countries. So that's an area where I strongly support U.S. military action. I think Biden did the right thing in attacking dozens of Houthi targets. Uh, so I do, of course, I do share the concerns of some fellow conservative Republicans in Congress that have said that's unconstitutional. He didn't declare, Congress didn't declare war. Um, Ideally, there should be some congressional military authorization, but I think those initial strikes were, uh, you know, authorized under the Constitution. I think further strikes should be approved by Congress. But shutting down 95% of Red Sea traffic, I think that's just unacceptable. It's that's something the U.S. has stood for, even when we were a small power, is the rights of freedom of navigation, freedom of commerce. I do think that's legitimate. I don't know to what extent we can cooperate. I know there were 5 countries involved. It was 4 other countries in the U.S. that were involved in the airstrikes. I'd like to see the highest possible degree of international cooperation with Arab states as well, as we try to, work to prevent any further Houthi attacks. I think those airstrikes sent the right message. I'm much with regards to our troops in Iraq and Syria. I think we need to pull them out. I think we need. I would be happy, even though I view Iran as an implacable enemy like China. I would be willing to negotiate with them and just simply say, you tell your proxies to stop all their attacks. We'll pull out all of our troops from Iraq and Syria. It's not our interest to be there. It hurts. Our troops there are being put in harm's way for no reason. They're not in furtherance of U.S. national security or defense. And Biden has denied them the air defenses they need to shoot down the enemy missiles. So we've had a lot of injuries. Thankfully, no deaths from the 131 plus attacks, Iranian proxy attacks against our troops there. But with regards to the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, I would continue to respond, very strongly against the Houthi rebels in Yemen.
We know that Lindsey Graham and John Bolton were advocating for bombing Iran, and the Netanyahu administration would be more than happy if the US does that. Do you think these people in the US and in the Netanyahu administration, at the end of the day, would they be able to bring a new conflict in the Middle East between US, Iran, and some other countries? In your opinion,
Yeah,
is that a big deal?
yeah, I think that would be a very big deal. I don't think even Lindsey Graham has talked about bombing Iran per se, but he's talked about bombing their oil derricks, their oil refineries that are in the Persian Gulf. Uh, you know, Destroying their navy, perhaps. Destroying a bunch of Iranian gunboats and corvettes. So that would be full scale, direct military action, and kind of declaring war, either in name or in fact, against Iran, and that's really scary because Iran is a nuclear power. We shouldn't be. Again, most people don't believe that, but the intel that I have says that they are a nuclear power. So we should not be in the business of starting wars against nuclear powers. We should be negotiating with nuclear powers. Iran, of course, is a much inferior nuclear power, but they have very strong nuclear superpower benefactors and allies in Russia and China, even North Korea. With very sizable nuclear arsenals. So all of these, one of the ideas that has been bandied about is maybe we could have we should have a new concert of Europe that could include Turkey and Spain and Russia and Germany and France and Britain and Italy, to kind of try to resolve these kinds of conflicts peacefully. But we could also have a global concert, a concert of perhaps the 6, uh, perhaps even 10. With Iran, we would have 10 nuclear powers, but certainly at least the top 6, which would include Russia, China, let's see, France, England, India, but probably 10 again, where all the nuclear powers could resolve these issues peacefully and meet together and come to compromise peace agreements. These are the things that happened in the good old days, between 1815, when the Napoleonic Wars ended with a fair peace for France, defeated France, which was brought back into again the concert of Europe and as an equal power. Versus the foolishness we did with Germany and destroying them and in both world wars, and leaving them out of even the League of Nations at the end of World War One, to prevent world wars from breaking out, or even regional wars, as you mentioned. Even if Iran and Israel had a direct regional war in which two nuclear powers were fighting each other, that would be very dangerous, even if the U.S. stayed out militarily. So yeah, we have to focus on peace and diplomacy. I'm a huge advocate for building up the U.S. military, mainly with strategic and homeland defenses, and pulling our troops out of foreign bases. Instead of 750 bases, military bases, should build down to perhaps 350. Where most of those bases are in the Caribbean and Western Hemisphere and in Pacific Islands, instead of the Far East and Europe and the Middle East. So yeah, there's a lot we can do. There's a lot we need to do, and sadly, there's only a few leaders that are advocating these real world solutions to avoid a nuclear war that could cost 1 billion lives. But I am hopeful, and certainly believe that if Trump were elected president, or again Vivek Ramaswamy or Governor DeSantis, that a lot of these foolish policies would end, and peace could be restored, at least to Europe and the Middle East.
Just before wrapping up this session, do you think the next president of the U.S. is going to be a Republican or Democrat?
Well, I really think that the Democrats are going to steal the election. People call me an election denier. I think they're the election deniers, because they ignore the facts before their faces, and all the mountains of circumstantial evidence that the Democrats stole the 2020 presidential election, and actually congressional elections as well. So I am very fearful that Biden will be reelected, or perhaps he'll drop out of the race at the last minute and endorse Kamala, or perhaps even Gavin Newsom, and then they'll pursue the same foolish warmongering policies that caused Tulsi Gabbard to leave the Democrat Party. So I'd love to tell you that I think the Republicans will win and establish a new peace with Russia as a peaceful partner. But unfortunately, I think the chances of that are fairly low. So yeah, we're in a very perilous state of affairs here in North America. Thankfully you're in, I think, Brazil, so you're much safer than most of the other countries in the world. The Southern Hemisphere is not under a major threat, but they would certainly, you guys would certainly be affected by loss of commerce if the U.S. were to be devastated or destroyed. You'd have to trade with other countries, and perhaps even China would suffer great damage as well.